What if Van Halen was a funk band? Find out on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hello, my name is Morgan Brown, and for the past few months now I've been making a series of music videos called What If videos. The idea of these is that every week I take a different popular song and then imagine a different circumstance or a decision that someone's made that causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know. This week I took on the Van Halen classic Runnin With The Devil and imagined how it would have sounded if it had been produced by a funk band. If you haven't had a chance to have a look at the video yet, it sounds a little bit like this.
Least I don't need to beg or borrow. Yes, I'm living at a place that kills. Ooh,
yeah. So, why Van Halen? Well, me and Van Halen go back a long way. They were the first band that I ever actually got into of my own accord as a child. And I grew up in a pretty musical household. There was always music playing, and from quite an early age my folks would play me music like Chuck Berry and the Beatles, Dire Straits were always on, that kind of thing. So I got interested in guitars and rock and roll and what have you. But really it was, I think, hearing the guitar solo in Beat It. I mean, Beat It was a song that had been playing kind of in the background for much of my life, but having got more interested in the guitar, I really heard the guitar solo in Beat It by Michael Jackson, and eventually managed to find out who it was who played that. This was pre-internet days, so you couldn't just go and look it up. I had to kind of hunt around for that info, but found out that it was this guy, Eddie Van Halen. Eventually found out that he was the guitarist in the band as well. I should say, being from the UK, Van Halen wasn't this kind of pervasive presence that I think they were in the US. They certainly had, hit records, but they weren't anywhere near as much of a massive deal in the UK as they were in the US. They didn't really tour as much here at all. I probably had heard Jump in passing, might have heard Why Can't This Be Love, but neither of those like big guitar songs, so I wouldn't have been really aware of him as this great guitarist as a small child. I heard the solo and Beat It, decided I was going to go and find out what this band sounded like. So I went down to my local Woolworths, and they had two Van Halen albums there. In my naivety, I just assumed, oh well, I'll go for the newest one. That's bound to be the best, right? So first Van Halen album I owned was, let me find it, this one. So that's OU812 from 1988. Got that home, absolutely loved it, and I'd never heard anything like it before. I had no context for this band. At the time, I had no idea that it had different lead singers. So obviously this is from the Sammy Hagar era. I didn't realize there'd been another era previously, but listened to this album, got very excited about it. The guitar playing was great, it rocked. I didn't know what most of the songs were about, but it all sounded cool to me. So saved up my pocket money and went back to buy the other album that they had in the same branch of Woolworths, which was this one, Van Halen 2 from 1979, actually released, I think, just a few days after I was born. And that was very different. It kind of took me aback a bit at first. I was like, who the hell's singing on this? This sounds really different. The guy's got kind of a weird voice. But once I got over that initial shock, I really warmed to it. Having grown up on 60s pop and early rock and roll, there was actually like a lot of stuff that I heard on that record that felt like it connected back to those kind of earlier forms of popular music, and I found that really exciting. And once I got over the shock of hearing Dave Lee Roth's voice as opposed to Sammy Hagar's, I guess Sammy Hagar's got this proper kind of classic rock, bluesy kind of gritty kind of sound, whereas Dave is kind of all over the place. He can sound like a bubblegum pop singer, but he's got all these kind of soul music inflections as well. Occasionally lapses into kind of Louis Armstrongish kind of scat singing. So it took a bit of getting used to, but undeniable charisma just kind of like pouring off every song. So I got really into that too. And then the next record I managed to get by them, once I'd saved up a bit, and I had to hunt around a bit more because I'd exhausted everything that was available in Woolworths, but eventually I managed to get hold of this one. This is Van Halen's debut album, self-titled, from 1978, and just absolutely incredible. Obviously, as anyone who's heard it knows, staggering guitar playing, but just great songs as well. Really tight, compact, catchy songs with just mind-blowing guitar work, staggering drums, just fantastic, great harmonies. Michael Anthony, Secret Weapon. Um, so I was completely hooked. Went and got everything I could to do with Van Halen. Inspired me to start playing the electric guitar. I petitioned my parents to combine Christmas and birthday presents and get this electric guitar that I'd seen in an advert in Metal Hammer magazine, which I'd now started getting because I was obviously instantly converted to heavy rock. Um, and it really kind of changed the course of my life, just kind of getting into this band. And yeah, I've always remained a massive fan, to the point where a couple of years ago I actually wrote a book about them, which is On Track Van Halen, available from all your favorite online retailers, including vanhalenstore.com. Shameless plug there. So check that out if you're interested. It's album by album, track by track, chronological breakdown of all Van Halen's records. Highly opinionated. If you're new to the band and you want to find out about them, it's a reasonable place to start, I'd say. So once I started doing this series of videos, I always kind of had in my mind, oh, maybe I'll do a Van Halen thing at some point if I can think of anything to do. I was just browsing through lists of isolated vocals, and I saw one for Runnin With The Devil, had a listen. Obviously, it's hysterical. Dave Lee Roth, young Dave Lee Roth on top form, whooping and hollering, absolutely outrageous. So I thought, okay, I can do something with this. And then, knowing as I do, because I'm a nerdy fan and because I've done quite a bit of research on Van Halen about their sort of background in their early years, I came up with a fun alternative universe scenario that I thought could lead to a different musical direction for this song. So it's 1973 and we're going into 1974. A young Dave Lee Roth has just joined the band that has just become Van Halen. They started out as Mammoth, Edward and Alex, and a guy called Mark Stone on bass, playing covers of various late 60s, early 70s hard rock stuff, just playing in backyard parties and around the Pasadena area where they were growing up. And David Lee Roth was a fan of the band and was trying to get into the band. He auditioned for them and they didn't accept him. Apparently wasn't a great singer. They just didn't like his whole vibe. He was kind of annoying and just not the kind of person you wanted to be in a band with. So he went and formed his own band called Red Ball Jet. And no recordings exist of this band, but by the accounts of people who did hear them at the time, it was very much more of a kind of soul R&B kind of band, not hard rock. They had kind of glitzy outfits, they had dance moves. It was very much more that kind of thing than the sort of serious hard rock that Eddie and his brother were pushing. But after Red Ball Jet breaks up, David Lee Roth makes another bid to join Mammoth. And this time he's got a bit of leverage because he owns his own PA system and he's been renting it to Mammoth. So this time round, they're not necessarily more convinced by his performance, but they do really want to be able to use the PA system. So they think, oh, we'll give him a chance. It was actually Dave Lee Roth's suggestion, apparently, to name the band Van Halen as well. I should say this. He thought that was a catchier name than Mammoth, I think correctly. And he pointed out that other bands named after their guitarists, such as Santana, that had been successful. So he convinced them to change the name. So we joined the band at this point in my alternative universe. Now, it's apparently true that when Dave joined the band, he tried to convince them to move away from just the hard rock covers. He was very much of the opinion that they should be playing music the girls can dance to, which in his mind was kind of soul and funk songs. And I know he did actually try and get them to cover Cold Sweat by James Brown, for instance. So I had this thought that, okay, Dave's joined the band, he's trying to push them in this direction. Edward and Alex are resisting. And what happened in the real world is obviously they made a compromise. So they carried on doing hard rock, but they incorporated some of Dave's influences too. They did some rocked up versions of soul songs. In this alternative scenario, Dave's not having any compromise. He's like, no, we need to be pursuing funk and soul or nothing. So Eddie and Alex figure, well, we didn't really want this guy in the band anyway. Let's just get rid of him. But Dave has an ace up his sleeve, which is that his dad's quite wealthy. He's an ophthalmologist. Did I say that right? I probably didn't. Um, but he's a wealthy medical man anyway. So Dave goes to his dad. He like asks him to engage his lawyers, and Dave kind of threatens legal action. He's like, I'm not getting kicked out of the band. This is my band now. I came up with the name. I get to keep Van Halen. If you guys don't want to do what I want to do, then you can split. And unfortunately, being the working class kids that they are, the Van Halen brothers have no way to kind of fight this. They can't hire their own lawyers. So they're basically kicked out of their own band. So Dave now has the name Van Halen and he can do what he wants with it. So he reconfigures Van Halen as a hard funk band. So that's how we end up with a version of Runnin With The Devil, but in this funk style. I figured Running with the Devil would be a fairly good candidate for this because it's got kind of like a fairly laid back, kind of mid tempo groove to it, which you could easily translate into a funk style. Not so much the more frantic kind of James Brown style funk that, well, what I tend to associate with James Brown anyway, but I was thinking more of like Parliament. I'm a pretty big fan of George Clinton, like both Parliament, his kind of hard funk outfit, and Funkadelic, which was more of his kind of like post Hendrix sort of like rock crossover outfit. So, I mean, that's kind of what I was going for with recreating Running with the Devil as a funk track. Now, obviously, it was never going to sound like a George Clinton track. George Clinton was a genius and also had a small army of the most gifted funk musicians in the world at his beck and call, whereas I'm like one middle-aged English nerd with GarageBand. But you know, I gave it my best shot. You can have a listen, see how I did. As usual, started with the isolated vocal, just syncing it up to the tempo grid. I noticed fairly immediately when listening to this isolated vocal that whoever isolated it from the original track had also sped it up. Originally, the song's in E flat. All of Van Halen used to tune down half a step when Dave Lee Roth was in the band. And whoever's isolated this vocal has sped the track up to try and bring it up to E natural. And I thought, oh, well, that'll be handy. Won't have to retune my guitars. Synced the vocal up, programmed some drums. Tried to keep the drums fairly simple because I think a lot of people, particularly kind of like white guys trying to sound funky, tend to really overplay when doing funk. I think they've heard like break beats and think that's what a funk drummer has to do all the time. I wanted to keep it simple and just get that kind of steady groove going. So I went for that and then put some bass on. Now, I'm no funk bass player. I've only ever really played the bass to make demos for my shitty punk songs. So I had a go at doing something approximately funky. A couple of slaps and pops in there, but mainly I just stuck to a nice kind of steady riff. And then, you know, came to trying to put everything else on. Unfortunately, when I started putting things on, other than the bass, I started to realize that whoever had sped up the vocal to make it in E natural had slightly undershot. So I started putting like horns on and keyboards, and it becomes apparent that the vocal is just a microtone or two short of being in key. So unfortunately, it sounds like Dave's singing flat. He's not. The original vocal's really in tune. Unfortunately, this one is a little bit flat. So sorry, Dave. I didn't mean to make you sound like you're singing out of tune. At this point, I could have just given up, but I thought, well, I've already done quite a lot of work, so I just carried on. I decided that the guitar riff, what is the guitar riff on the original record, I was going to split between a horn section, which obviously, I don't have horns, so that's MIDI horns, and then a little synth line as well. Added a synth bass to kind of double the bass line on the chorus as well. Thinking of like Flashlight by Parliament, which has a great prominent synth bass line. I also double it occasionally with a clavie, which is another kind of like really 70s-y kind of sound. I just like to have it on there. It always makes me think of like early 70s Stevie Wonder. So I thought it wouldn't hurt to have that on there too. And there's a couple of bits of Hammond organ which come in to just kind of bolster things in the choruses as well. And then threw on a couple of guitars. So in one speaker you've got high, choppy, compressed chordal stuff, and then on the other side I've just got another thing playing just improvised single note lines with like an auto wah effect on. Another annoying thing with the isolated vocal track that I selected is that sometimes these isolated vocals will have backing vocals on too. This one didn't, and the backing vocals are a big part of Runnin With The Devil, particularly because Dave himself doesn't actually sing Runnin With The Devil at any point. That hook is all in the backing vocals, so I thought, oh God, what am I going to do? Particularly as, Van Halen's harmonies, they're kind of really high and clear, great singing, particularly from Michael Anthony, who has this kind of countertenor voice. And there was no way I was going to be able to replicate that. So I thought, well, maybe I could do it with like a vocoder, just for added 70s kind of corniness. So I had a little hunt around. Unfortunately, you don't appear to be able to get a vocoder plugin for GarageBand at the moment. So I tried to mimic a vocoder sound by recording the three vocal parts as best I can. You can't really sing at full volume in my flat, very thin walls, and I really don't want to upset my neighbours. But I recorded the vocals as best I could, and then I used really unsubtle auto-tune on them to kind of create a bit of a robotic effect, and then smothered them in phasing and compression just to make them sound even less human. So I think it sounds a bit vocodery and just kind of gives it a bit more of that kind of like proper sort of mid to late 70s cheesy sort of feel.
God damn it, baby, no, I ain't lying to you. I'm only gonna tell you one time.
Yeah, just for a bit of extra sort of rhythmic punch, I threw on some hand claps, quite a bit of percussion stuff. So there's various like cowbells and things going on there too, just to really emphasize that backbeat. It definitely doesn't sound like Parliament, but does it sound like a bunch of white guys who David Lee Roth might have hired in the mid 70s trying to sound like Parliament? Maybe. I don't know. For like one nerd with GarageBand attempting a genre that I've never tried to play before, I think I could have done worse. I don't know. I had fun with it. I enjoyed putting together a video. Found some cool footage of people like dancing to actual funk music in a club in the late 70s, early 80s. So synced all that up because there's horns on my record, but obviously Van Halen didn't have a horn section. I borrowed some footage of the Bar-Kays horn section to crowbar in there. The only footage I could find of Van Halen performing the song was from the Us Festival, which was tricky to sync up because it's a show where Dave Lee Roth was notoriously inebriated, so his vocal that night only bears the sort of vaguest passing resemblance to what he did on the record, but I think I just about managed to get something that looked like it syncs up reasonably well. So give it a listen and a watch, see what you think. By all means, drop me a comment, positive or negative. I'll steel myself, I'll take it. It'll be okay. And if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. And if you've got any other ideas about things you'd like me to try, any songs you'd like me to take on, any styles you'd like me to try and have a go at, any artists you'd like me to grapple with, then do just let me know in the comments as well. That would be great. Otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.